October 10th, 1944, near Debrecen, Hungary. We had been moving for days, constantly retreating from the Red Army. The Soviets were relentless, pushing through our defenses as if they were paper. Our orders were to hold the line near Debrecen, a city that had become critical to slowing the Soviet advance. But deep down, we knew this was a losing battle. The weather was cold, and the fields were soaked with rain. Mud clung to everything: the tanks, our boots, even the food. I watched as the younger soldiers tried to dig trenches, their shovels sinking uselessly into the thick sludge. We were exhausted, physically and mentally. The Soviets had broken through to the Carpathian Basin, and it felt like we were the last thin shield standing between them and the heart of Hungary. October 12th, 1944, defensive position, south of Debrecen. We heard the rumble of their tanks long before they appeared on the horizon. The T-34s were monsters, and our Panzer IVs seemed so small in comparison. My men were nervous, whispering among themselves. Some were veterans from earlier campaigns in Russia, others were fresh-faced replacements who had never seen a battle like this. When the first shell hit, everything became chaos. The roar of artillery was deafening, shaking the ground beneath us. We returned fire, but it felt useless. The Soviet armor kept advancing, and soon we were forced into close combat. I was shouting orders, my voice hoarse, trying to rally the men. Bullets whizzed past, and the air was thick with smoke. I saw one of our panzers take a direct hit, flames burst out, and the crew tried to escape, but it was too late. The Soviets kept coming, wave after wave, like they had an endless supply of men and machines. We had no choice but to pull back again. October 16th, 1944, in the hills, west of Debrecen. After days of constant fighting and retreat, we found ourselves in the hills trying to regroup. The men were exhausted, supplies were running low, food and ammunition were scarce, and morale was crumbling. We'd lost so many in the past week. Some of the men started talking about surrender, but that was unthinkable to me. I couldn't let myself believe it would come to that. We were told reinforcements were on the way, but none of us believed it anymore. The Soviets had momentum, and we were barely holding on. I wrote a letter to my family that night, unsure if I would ever see them again. Every day, it seemed like we were one step closer to the end of the war, and not the victory we had once imagined. October 20th, 1944, the fall of Debrecen. The final blow came on October 20th. We were ordered to fall back further, leaving Debrecen to the Soviets. I watched as the city burned in the distance, the glow lighting up the night sky. It was over. Hungary was slipping from our grasp, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. As we moved westward, I couldn't help but think how far we had come, how far we had fallen. From the early days of triumph in France to the slow, grinding defeat here on the Eastern Front, everything had changed. Now, all we had left was survival. No more grand victories, no more dreams of a greater Reich. The only goal was to make it out alive. November 1st, 1944, on the road to Nyíregyháza, Hungary. The orders were clear: keep retreating, hold off the Soviets as long as possible, and fall back toward the Carpathian Mountains. The once proud German forces were now a shattered collection of men and machines, trying to slow down an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Every day, we were losing ground, but we were told to keep fighting, keep delaying the Soviets to buy time. We moved through villages and towns that had become ghostly. Civilians had fled, leaving behind empty homes and farms. The roads were clogged with retreating German units, Hungarian soldiers, and refugees. The weather was getting colder, and snow began to fall, making the roads treacherous. As we approached Nyíregyháza, I saw the faces of the men, tired, dirty, and hollow. We had been fighting for years now, and it felt like the weight of the entire Eastern Front was crushing us. Every battle, every skirmish, drained our hope a little more. November 5th, 1944, skirmish at Nyíregyháza. The Soviets were close. We dug in near Nyíregyháza, trying to hold a defensive position. Our artillery had been set up, and we were prepared to defend against the Soviet tanks and infantry that were coming. I remember the sky being a dull gray, the sun hidden behind thick clouds, giving the battlefield an eerie stillness before the storm. Then the attack came. Soviet artillery pounded our positions first. The ground shook, and explosions threw dirt and debris everywhere. We fired back, but the Soviet forces kept coming. I saw their tanks, the T-34s, rolling forward, with infantry behind them. Our own tanks, now fewer in number, engaged them, but the odds were against us. I crouched in the trench, rifle in hand, shouting orders to my men. Bullets flew overhead, and the roar of battle drowned out everything. It was chaos. One of my comrades fell next to me, shot through the chest. There was no time to help him. The enemy was pushing us back. We fought for every inch of ground, but the Soviets overwhelmed us with their numbers. November 8th, 1944 retreat into the mountains. After days of fighting, we had no choice but to retreat again. We abandoned Nyíregyháza, leaving it to the Soviets. My unit, what was left of it, was ordered to fall back toward the Carpathians, where we would try to regroup with other German forces. The snow was falling heavily now, and the roads were becoming impassable. We marched through the cold, half-starved, and carrying our wounded on makeshift stretchers. The men barely spoke, each one lost in his own thoughts. It felt like we were walking toward an uncertain future, with defeat hanging over us like a shadow. Every step was harder than the last. I could see the exhaustion in the men's faces, and some of them began to collapse from the cold and hunger. We had no time to rest. Rumors spread that the Soviets were right behind us, and if they caught us, there would be no mercy. November 12th, 1944, Carpathian foothills. We finally reached the foothills of the Carpathians, but there was no relief. We were still being pursued, and the terrain was difficult to navigate. Our once powerful army was now reduced to scattered, broken units, trying to survive in the harsh winter. The mountains offered some cover, but supplies were running low. We were freezing, hungry, and tired. I thought of home often, wondering if I'd ever see my family again. The war that had started with such confidence and ambition was now an endless retreat, and for the first time, I began to wonder if we would ever stop running. December 1st, 1944, the depths of the Carpathians. We were deep into the Carpathian Mountains now, the terrain unforgiving. Snow blanketed everything, and the bitter cold was unrelenting. The men were barely holding on. Frostbite had claimed several of them already, and the rest of us had no choice but to keep moving. Supplies were nearly non-existent. We were surviving on whatever scraps we could find, eating frozen rations and drinking melted snow. The silence of the mountains was haunting. It was a strange contrast to the constant roar of battle we had grown used to. Instead of gunfire and explosions, it was the wind howling through the trees, cutting through our already thin clothing. It was quiet, but not peaceful, more like the calm before another storm. Morale was crumbling. I could see it in the men's eyes. Some had started to lose hope, mumbling to themselves, staring blankly into the snow. Others tried to stay focused, but it was clear everyone was on edge. We knew the Soviets were close, and there was nowhere to run. This was supposed to be a retreat, but it felt more like we were being cornered. December 7th, 1944, Soviet ambush. The attack came when we least expected it. We had set up a small camp in a valley, hoping for a brief rest, but the Soviets had found us. They launched a surprise ambush at dawn. I'll never forget the sound of mortars exploding in the stillness, ripping through the trees and sending snow and debris flying. We scrambled to defend ourselves, grabbing our rifles and diving for cover. The air was filled with the crack of gunfire and the shouts of men. I could see Soviet infantry moving down the ridge, firing as they advanced. Our men fired back, but we were outnumbered and outgunned. It became a brutal fight for survival. I shouted orders, trying to rally the men, but panic was spreading. The Soviets were closing in, and we had nowhere to run. I could feel the cold steel of desperation in my chest as I fought, trying to keep the enemy at bay. The ground beneath us was slick with snow and blood. In the chaos, I saw one of our machine guns jam, and the soldier manning it was hit by a sniper. I rushed over, taking his place, feeling the burning sting of the cold metal as I struggled to get the gun working again. It felt like hours, but it was only minutes before we were forced to pull back. We managed to break free of the ambush, but we had lost many men. Those who survived were shaken, wounded, or both. There was no time to mourn, we had to keep moving. The Soviets were relentless, and if we stopped, they would catch up. December 14th, 1944, the Mountain Pass. After the ambush, we made our way deeper into the mountains, following narrow, treacherous paths. The snow was heavier now, and the cold was unbearable. Each step felt like a battle of its own. I could see the exhaustion in every man's face, the way their breath came in ragged gasps, freezing in the air. The wounded were struggling the most. Some had to be carried, but we didn't have enough strength to help everyone. The sound of a man collapsing in the snow, too weak to continue, became all too common. We had to leave them behind, there was no other choice. It was a cruelty we had become used to, but it didn't make it any easier. We reached a mountain pass that was supposed to lead us to relative safety, but it was guarded by Soviet forces. They had anticipated our retreat and set up a blockade. We were trapped, pinned between the advancing Soviets and the freezing mountains. We had no choice but to try and break through. It was madness, but we couldn't turn back. The attack was desperate and violent. Bullets whizzed past as we charged, slipping on the icy ground, fighting for every inch. The Soviets had the advantage, they were prepared, and we were not. I remember seeing one of our tanks, a Panzer IV, slide on the ice and crash into a boulder, its gun still firing as it went down. We were fighting with everything we had, but it wasn't enough. Slowly, the Soviets pushed us back, and we were forced to retreat once more, deeper into the wilderness, with fewer men and even less hope. December 21st, 1944, the longest night. Winter had fully set in. The nights were long and brutal, the cold so intense it felt like it was seeping into our bones. We made camp in a small cave, huddled together for warmth, but it wasn't enough. I could hear the men coughing, their breath rattling in the freezing air. Some were too weak to stand, let alone fight. We lit a small fire, but it barely provided warmth. The wood was damp, and the smoke stung our eyes. I stared into the flames, thinking about home. I hadn't seen my family in years, and I began to wonder if I ever would again. The war, once a proud mission of conquest, now felt like a slow death. I kept a journal, writing down everything that had happened. I needed to remember. I needed to make sense of the madness we were living in. The men around me were silent, lost in their own thoughts. Some prayed, others just stared at the snow falling outside the cave. That night felt like it would never end. Every hour dragged on, the cold jawing at us, the sound of distant gunfire reminding us that the Soviets were never far away. It was the longest night of my life.